What's up, guys? I'm nobody special, and I got my buddy Travis from Real Estate Mindset is back with us today. We are going to talk about CPI. It's coming up on Wednesday of this week, on April 10th. We get our next CPI report. Whenever I hear about CPI, I'm always thinking about the rent because that's the big variable in that CPI math. It counts for almost a quarter of the index. I got my buddy Travis come in. We're going to talk about what's putting upward pressure on rents, what's putting downward pressure on rents, where we might be going in the future, because this affects the inflation situation. And of course, that affects what the Fed does. What the Fed does affects interest rates and mortgage rates, and ultimately the price of our houses. Let me set the table for you. All right. Jerome Powell spoke at the FOMC a few weeks ago in the most recent meeting. And during his press conference, he kind of went out of his way to mention how he wasn't being dismissive of a recent trend of a rise in inflation. He kept saying, we're data dependent. I don't want to seem like I'm dismissing these CPI reports. And then, of course, he would go on to immediately dismiss those CPI reports. What he's saying is, we've seen higher inflation readings January, February, March now, but he doesn't think that is a new trend. What he's referring to, in my opinion, is he is expecting the rent to start dragging CPI lower. And that's something I've been talking about on this channel for the better part of a year, because we saw astronomical increases in rents in 2021 and 22, and there was a delayed effect. It took time for that to filter through into the CPI because of the way CPI measures rent. It's no joke. They call people up at home and say, how much would you rent your house out for? And then whatever they answer, that's what they report in the inflation statistics. And so there's this lag of about a year to a year and a half between when rents actually rise or fall and when it shows up in CPI. And so Jerome Powell is telling us that the rent, in his opinion or in his data, stopped going up about a year and a half ago, and that he thinks any day now that's going to start to bring down the CPI math. And so, well, let's talk about it. What are you seeing when you look at rents and when you look into what some of these regional data is doing?
Well, I'm seeing some pretty mind-blowing trends, Jack. I'm seeing trends that actually I didn't anticipate. I anticipated we would start 2024 with a continued, even disinflationary run on rent. We had actually several months, I think almost for a year, not quite, but we had several months of either rent growth slowing or going down altogether. And so I was like, yeah, we're almost there, guys. Plus we have all the apartments being built, right, and coming to the market. So I was like, this is great for us. But what we noticed, man, is we actually noticed, at least so far this year, where not only is rent starting to go up again, the trajectory of the rent increases from the most recent reports are shockingly bad, meaning that they're like from what is it? I think from February to March, there's a substantial increase in shelter costs for rent. And so, if I can, Jack, if I could show the viewers a couple of these reports, starting with this, guys, I always want to start here because I always want to remind people that everyone. Oh, not everyone, but there is a lot of Americans, hundreds of millions, or maybe tens of millions of Americans that are broke. You guys can see here we have an updated we have updated information on the amount of Americans living paycheck to paycheck, which is 78%. So 78% of Americans, according to this survey, are living paycheck to paycheck. That is a 6% increase year over year. So at the same time, people are living paycheck to paycheck. Real M2 money supply, real median household income is going down. So everything's going up.
For a second, Travis. Let me pause you here. So this is important here. 78% of people living paycheck to paycheck. All right. And I'm assuming that includes most of your renters there, right? Because I'm gonna go out on a limb and say your renters probably have fewer assets and less savings than your homeowners. All right. So that's telling me people are not going to be able to absorb rental increases. If they're already going paycheck to paycheck, then already you're talking about people who are about to be priced out of the rental market. So that is downward pressure on rents by people suffering from the rate of inflation, even though the rents are moving in the other direction. So we're seeing tension between tenant and landlord increasing here. And you're showing us real median income is falling. All right. Now, real median, that's income adjusted for inflation, that's falling. So that is also putting downward pressure on rents. Am I interpreting this data correctly?
Well, right. And then so when you look at this data, you would ask, well, how can people afford increased rents when for the last 3 years, 4 years, their income has been going down? And we'll get to that here in a second in the video. But I want to show the viewers, look at the substantial increase of rent. And if you guys look here in February, rents are 3.5% higher year over year. And now, people say, well, that's not that bad. Well, it actually is bad because we're doing quantitative tightening in the run up over the past 3 years. Now, the average rent growth is 4.1. So it is in line with the average rent growth. But the fact that this is in February, the beginning of the year, the slower part of the year is honestly, man, I mean, this is quite shocking to me. So when we ask the question, how could rents possibly going up when we have supply going up, when we have people's affordability going down, demand going down? How is this happening? And so, Jack, that brought us to the next thing, which is basically, and you found this out because my question, Jack, is like, here's the data on rent. Inflation's coming back. We didn't even have time for the other lag effects to squash the inflation, like what Jack said, before we have this additional round of rent inflation. How, Jack? How's that possible? And so I'm not sure if you have the data, but that's when Jack really kind of brought us to this next thing. And honestly, Jack, I try to stay away from this topic of conversation.
All right. So first things first, what we're looking at on my screen here is the most recent CPI report for, I believe this was the February report. All right. So here is your shelter index. It's the largest component of CPI. Within shelter is rent and owner's equivalent rent. And the latest reading showed 5.7% annual rent inflation. Now, the data point you just gave us showed 3.5% increases in rent year over year. All right. So according to that, we would expect, believe it or not, lower CPIs because of that information. Now, that lower CPI doesn't mean price is going down. An important distinction, guys. Inflation is a rate of change. Price is absolute level. So you can have prices going up and inflation coming down at the same time. And it does look like that's what that data is telling us, because CPI is still telling us 5.7% inflation in shelter, while the asking rents on the ground is saying 3.5%. So that's another data point for lower shelter inflation readings in CPI. I don't know if that's going to show up in this next report here, because again, there's a big lag. We're still seeing higher readings from the last time shelter costs rose substantially. Now, there's an important thing you got to keep in mind when we're talking about rents. Rent is like everything else, price is a subject of supply and demand. All right. And we have housing supply, the number of houses. Now, could you talk for just a quick moment about when it comes to rentals? We've covered the supply situation. What direction is supply moving in the rental market?
As far as the inventory in the rental market, I mean, inventory has shot up. I mean, but the thing is it usually does this time of year, right? Going into spring, the winter season, it shoots up. But not only is it normal, shooting up because of normal seasonality, inventory overall is exploding in the rental market, not in every metro area, but in many metro areas as a result of the multifamily new construction going on. So we do have more inventory. The problem, Jack, is a lot of these landlords, and especially if it's new construction, they have higher prices than the market. So the people that are building the new, they're like, well, we just built a brand new house. We can charge more. And so there may be a situation forming now where actually those new apartments that are coming to the market are actually increasing rent because they're paying an additional premium for new inventory. And I go back to you guys, it's not sustainable because incomes went down, real incomes went down at the same time where the cost of living exploded. And so there's only a certain amount of time, in my opinion, that lasts before there is some type of correction in the rental market.
So supply is rising, and supply is rising pretty substantially, it sounds like. We've talked about this in other videos. A lot of multifamily is in the pipeline being built right now. We've also got a lot of Airbnbs are starting to hit the market, right? The bans, and we know Airbnbs just aren't cash flowing like they used to. So that's going to hit the long-term rental market also. So supply is moving up. All right. So we've got this situation where the incomes are flat or to down when adjusted for inflation. Supply is moving up. These are all things that are suggestive of lower prices for rents. And
Mhm.
last year, for a little while, we did see lower prices, but we're not now. Prices are rising again. They're still rising less than the rate of inflation. So you're probably still looking at lower CPI rents, at least in the near term. Now let's talk about demand. Now, demand with housing is pretty simple. Demand is a function of how many people need a place to live, right? Now, what we're
Right.
looking at on this screen is the native born population in the United States. And guys, you can probably tell where we're going to go with this. We're going to keep it factual here. We're not going to get too political or anything like that. It's obviously a sensitive subject. But the native born population in the United States is relatively flat. All right. It is up since 2019, about 217.7 million prior to the pandemic. Right now, it's about 218.8. I would also add that it's falling here. That's interesting to see the native born population in the U.S. start to fall. I think that's probably a function of declining birth rates or possibly even people moving out of the country. I don't know if that's a thing or not. But you've got some population growth here. It's not enormous, but I don't think this really tells the story of a big surge in demand. Now, you can probably tell where I'm going with this. Now, look at the population level over the same time period, but this is now foreign born. And you can see prior to the pandemic in the beginning of 2019, we had about 43.5 million foreign born people living in the US. Now, this includes legal and illegal immigration, guys. So this isn't all just function of the southern border, but obviously that's a big input. But you can see a lot of growth here in the foreign-born population, now at 49.03 million. So, since 2020, we've seen a growth by about 7 million of foreign-born individuals living in the United States. And this is a massive source of demand for housing. All right, that's the thing. You got a lot of people who now need a place to live. It is inevitable that this is going to place pressure on the rental market. So, yeah, we do have supply moving up. We've got all these new apartments in the pipeline, and Airbnbs are going bust, and they're hitting the market. But at the same time, the demand, it looks like, is rising faster. And so we get results like that article that you gave us showing rents are increasing. There's just more people here. And so we need more places to live. And this, I think, this chart is preventing the asking rents from coming down further. Now, I would add that, we still have the problem of wages and the problem of affordability. So let's talk about that for a second here. Let's look at the employment level among native born. This is people born in the United States. And I would add that native born, that also includes the children of immigrants, right? If you're born in this country, you are a natural born U.S. citizen. The employment level among natural born U.S. citizens is actually down from pre-pandemic levels. We were at 131.7 million at our peak in 2019. Now here we are at 130.2. So you've got fewer native born Americans are in the job market. And then if you look at the employment level for foreign born along that same time period, going back to the beginning of 2019, pre-pandemic, we were around 27.7 million foreign-born people working in the United States. Now we are at 31.1 million. So a gain of, what's that, about 3.5 million. So what's the effect here of all of these people coming into the country? And again, we're trying to keep this factual. I know this is an emotionally charged subject, but you've got a lot of people are coming into the country. They're adding to demand for housing. And at the same time, they're adding to supply of labor. And we can see the employment level among foreign-born workers is growing astronomically while it's actually falling for native-born. So you've got wage suppression happening in the same time. So what's the aggregate effect here? We talked about how people living paycheck to paycheck. That's because the cost of living has outstripped wage growth. Well, the cost of living is going up because demand has risen. More people here, demand for rent rises. And then real wage growth, well, the wages are being suppressed because more people here, more supply of labor, preventing wages from rising faster. So the supply of the homes is increasing, but the demand end is increasing because more people coming in. Wages are growing, but just barely higher than the rate of inflation. So give me your opinion now. I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit based on all these data points. What do you think home inflation is going to look like in the CPI print we got coming up Wednesday, and then in the future beyond that?
Well, the thing, I mean, when we ask, I mean, what are the other possibilities? How could rent have been shooting up over the last couple of months when we presented all this other data? So, although we don't know with 100% certainty, the probability that the immigration is a direct result of the increased shelter and CPI, I think is justifiable to say that. And so the thing is, Jack, is that we're also in an election year. And to answer your question, I don't know. It depends who's president. We got one person that wants to kick everyone out, and we got another person that wants to welcome everyone in. And so that really depends, in my opinion, on who's elected. And I'm not going to go into politics, okay? I mean, it's the worst two evil thing for me. But if the demand exceeds the supply, the prices will go up. And so even though we have this all-time record supply, right, apartments being built, even though we have that, it's historical. The inventory coming to the market is historical. But if there's historical demand for rent, all right, and that's from immigration, that will hurt us. And don't forget, it's in every state, it's cheaper to rent now than it is to own. So it doesn't necessarily all immigration, right, Jack? It could also be, people just deciding that they can't buy a home or selling their house to go rent, because at this point, it's just, quite frankly, it's like 40, 50% cheaper to rent right now than it is to buy. And so it's a very intriguing thing, because
So
we're
let me
not.
pause you again real quick, because
Yeah, yeah.
that point that you just made, that's a very important point. Cheaper to rent than to own in every state now. So that, in my opinion, there's two ways you could look at that. That means the landlords need to raise the rent in order to make those properties cash flow positive. So you could argue that means rents need to go higher, or you could argue that if 78% of people are already living paycheck to paycheck, like you told us, and it's already cheaper to rent than to own, then that tells me there's a lot of landlords that are about to go out of business and put their homes up for sale because they can't raise the rent because people can't afford to pay it. So
Well, what would
which one do you think is more likely in that scenario?
Well, let me tell you this, okay? When I review articles, whether it's from the government, whether it's from a research institution, and we look back at what really happened in the GFC, it wasn't just subprime loans. In fact, the articles and the reports, there are multiple reports that say the predominant reason for the collapse and really a domino effect of a crisis was because of speculation from investors, not subprime loans. And so the speculation is worse today than the GFC. So I definitely think that a bloodbath is going to happen with investors. It just hasn't yet, especially, Jack, when we understand and start to really look at, like, a lot of that stuff was only cash flowing at 2 and 3% interest rates. And then we go forward and we look at, well, there's still people buying because they're like drug addicts. And a lot of them are realtors, and they're purchasing Airbnbs instead of the 2 and 3s. I'm sorry, they're purchasing residents instead of 2 and 3s. They're purchasing now at the 7 and 8s, with the only ability for them to cash flow is Airbnb. And so not only do we have high, double interest rates in 2 and 3%, we also have the restriction and the enforcement of Airbnb. We have, again, the lack of income. So I definitely think that investors are going to take a hit. I don't know exactly when and how. And I also think that, to answer your later question, I think CPI is going to come in hot. I think it's going to come in hot because, like you pointed out, a big part of CPI, I think it's like 30 or 40%, I'm not sure, is shelter, right? And so we just showed you the trajectory. We're going into now March, which is arguably hotter than February in the rental market. So my question is why would CPI come in lower?
Now, let me just again make the distinction between inflation, rate of change, and price, absolute level. All right, this chart right here is showing us in what do we got? In blue is the shelter index in CPI, and in orange is the shelter index in PCE, the other measure of inflation. And this is showing us year over year change. And you can see here, starting about a year and a half ago, the year over year change in shelter inflation started to come down rapidly. Now it's still at 5.7%. That's what we got in our latest CPI read. So this has been falling pretty steadily. It's still higher than the overall index. So it's still dragging the CPI index higher, even though it is having less and less of an effect over time. Now, what we just saw with a 3.5% year over year increase in these most recent numbers would suggest that this is going to keep falling at least to 3.5%, which isn't that much lower from here. But it's also important to keep in mind the lag and the directional change, because the rent was negative last year, even though CPI was still showing us 7%, 8% growth last year, when it was actually negative because of the lagging effect. It takes time. So right now we're still seeing last year's price drops make their way into the CPI math. Meanwhile, this year prices are starting to rise again. And so the next wave of inflation is already on the horizon. And we've got this 1 year to 18-month delay before it shows up. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is the rental statistics in CPI over the next few months are going to be really hard to handicap, because we've got a big lag effect at the same time that the next wave is already starting to show. And Jerome Powell seems to be of the opinion that rent is going to continue lower for a while. He might be right about that. He might not. And then to your point, meanwhile, all the other statistics like energy costs and food costs, they're all going up in CPI at the same time. It's really hard to gauge right now. I'll be honest with you. It's really hard to say what inflation is going to do on Wednesday when we get it. But I can tell you one way or another, the average person is still struggling from that big increase in shelter costs that we saw in 2021 and 2022. The wages have not risen enough to offset that. And based on what's going on with population demographics and, supply and demand in the labor market, I don't think those wages are going to see any big increases anytime soon. So a lot of data there, Travis. Some data points are saying lower shelter inflation. Some are saying higher. Folks, let us know in the comments which one you think it's going to be. What do you think the shelter index is going to do in CPI? It's 1/4 of the entire inflation math is one single data point, owner's equivalent rent. And so this is going to have a huge impact on the direction of inflation and thus monetary policy and thus the housing market moving forward. So it's a very important data point. And I'm going to sit here and honestly tell you, I don't know where it's going to go from here, because you've got some pretty powerful forces pulling in opposite directions. Travis, I'll give you the last word. Anything else you think that's important to this shelter equation and the inflation?
Well, I would just say this last thing, Jack, is I want to really caution people that are kind of maybe a little bit optimistic. They're maybe a little bit bullish. And also I want to talk to people that maybe have anxiety. They're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? What do I do? What do I do? Understand that I have to be careful saying this, because I will say that without the deficit, we're already in depression, but we're not in a technical recession yet. And what that means is if you are worried about a recession, if you're worried about the things that Jack and I are talking about, this means that you can do something about it right now. And also understand it's okay to rent. You could, I'm literally saving $1,500 extra a month by renting. I've been able to save $40,000 by renting versus owning. So don't be ashamed if you're renting. Things right now are temporary. Obviously, we don't want to rent forever. We want to own real estate, but right now it's just a really bad time overall to do that. So again, if you're struggling, understand it's not too late. If I would have changed my spending habits 6 months before I had a foreclosure, bankruptcy, and repo during the great financial crisis, I would be a different man today. But I didn't have someone, Jack, tapping on my shoulder say, hey, you could still change. You could still get ahead of this. You could still do what you need to do to get ahead. And a lot of those things are just rebudgeting and repurposing how you spend your money. A lot of that can be saved in going out to eat and canceling subscriptions. So again, I want to say, don't be paralyzed in fear or in hope. What we should be doing right now is we should be pulling back into our households and coming up with a safe plan forward. And what I mean by safe plan, cut expenditures, save money, and love your life.
Great stuff, Travis. And you're right. It's cheaper to rent. So rent. If the market conditions are in your favor, if you're renting right now, I know everybody has that dream of home ownership someday. But right now you are paid to wait. That's the important thing. You can put that extra money in your pocket. Now, it's only a benefit to yourself if you pay yourself with that extra money that you're saving by renting instead of buying. If you take that extra money and you just go out and consume, then you're helping the asset owners, you're helping the ruling class, you're doing what they want you to do, but you're not going anywhere yourself. So have the discipline to pay yourself with that money you're saving by renting versus just going out and buying more cheap crap, and then you're still in the same situation you've always been in. Travis, I want to thank you so much for your time. Folks, that is Real Estate Mindset. I'm going to put a link down below. He's got an excellent channel, great stuff, local, real estate analysis. He tours all over the country and looks at the overbuilding that's going on. Really fantastic stuff. Travis, thanks again for your time. Folks, check out Travis's channel. Tell him nobody sent you. Everybody, till next time, live small and dream big.